Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on the relationship between Scotland and Israel in light of the impact of devolution in the United Kingdom. The UK, some argue, is now a quasi-federal state in which extensive powers of government and legislation have been devolved to the Scottish Government and Parliament, and the relationship between Israel and Scotland has gone through a number of developments, impacted in part by devolution, by internal Scottish party politics, and as a result of Brexit, where previous limits on the powers of government under EU law have in some areas been lifted. In the next hour, we will explore the consequences of Scottish devolution for relations with Israel. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Professor Adam Tomkins, the John Millar Professor of Public Law at the University of Glasgow. He specialises in constitutional law and served as legal advisor to the House of Lords Constitution Committee for 6 years, from 2009. In 2014, he was appointed to the Smith Commission on Devolution, following the Scottish independence referendum. In 2015, he served as constitutional advisor to the Secretary of State for Scotland. And in 2016, Professor Tomkins was elected as a member of Scottish Parliament for the Glasgow region. He sat in the Scottish Parliament until 2021. He served on the Finance and Constitution, Social Security and COVID-19 committees, before becoming convener of the Justice Committee in 2020. Adam has written 2 of the leading works on British constitutional law, and since leaving Parliament, he's been appointed as a senior fellow at Policy Exchange. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your questions to our speaker into the Q&A facility on Zoom, and we will address them in the context of the discussion to follow. Professor Tomkins, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I thought I would just try and outline a little bit about the Scottish political situation, insofar as it is relevant to questions relating to Israel, before talking about a piece of legislation which I think is going to crystallise quite a lot of the issues which perhaps in the first few minutes of my remarks I'll talk about rather generally. So Scottish politics is not like British politics, I think it's fair to say, because the fundamental question in Scottish politics, the fundamental divide in Scottish politics is still the constitutional question. So the fundamental divide, the biggest divide in Scottish politics, even now, nearly 9 years on from the independence referendum, is still a yes-no divide. Yes, are you in favour of independence, or no, do you want Scotland to remain part of the UK? That is a bigger cleavage, if you will, in Scottish politics than right-left, and certainly bigger than leave-remain. Scotland did, of course, take part in the EU referendum in 2016, but it never caught fire here in Scotland in the way that it did south of the border. And the Leave-Remain issue, big as it is, failed to move the yes-no issue from, as it were, the top peg. So Scottish politics is structurally different from politics in the rest of the UK. And that is, of course, one of the greatest successes of the nationalists, because the nationalists, to whom I opposed in my political views, have spent the last 20 years or more trying to define Scotland as being, as it were, different from England, and to define Scottish politics as being different from English politics. The centre of political gravity in Scotland is probably to the left of the centre of political gravity south of the border. And this manifests itself particularly keenly at the moment in the identity of the devolved Scottish government, the devolved Scottish administration in Holyrood, which is an SNP Green coalition. It's not formally called a coalition, but it is a coalition. There are two Green ministers in Humza Yousaf's government, as there were two Green ministers in Nicola Sturgeon's government. It is, to all intents and purposes, a coalition administration. And between the two of them, they have an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament. And then there are three opposition parties: the Conservatives, the Labour Party, and the Scottish Liberal Democrats. And the political identity of the current SNP leadership, and certainly the political identity of the Scottish Green Party, is hostile to Israel. There's no question about that. And there's no point beating about the bush about that. They're not neutral on the question of Israel. They're not supportive of Israel. They are hostile to Israel. That was also true, I think, of Nicola Sturgeon's administration. It isn't true, however, of everybody in the SNP. And the SNP is a complex coalition of people who want to seek independence for Scotland for different reasons. Alex Salmond's SNP was a very different beast from Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf's SNP. And Salmond certainly was not hostile to Israel in the way that his successors have been. But to give you an example, an upsetting one, but nonetheless, to give you an example of just how hostile some elements of the Scottish government are to Israel, consider, for example, that the Scottish Green Party, which is the minor party in the Scottish government, but is formally part of the Scottish government, the Scottish Green Party refuses even to endorse the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. At their party conference, the Scottish Greens have voted in favour of a motion which described Israel as, I quote, a racist state, unquote, based on, again, I quote, Jewish supremacy, unquote, and which called Zionism a racist endeavour. So we have to face the fact, I'm afraid, that such extreme views as these, and they are, in my view, extreme, are held by ministers in a devolved administration in the United Kingdom. And that is just one reflection of the generality of the point that I'm seeking to make in these opening remarks. The current First Minister of Scotland is, of course, Humza Yousaf. It is, I think, also relevant to point out that Humza Yousaf is married to a woman called Nadia El Nakla, who has family in Gaza. When there was an escalation of violence in Gaza in May 2021, which, as we all know, also saw a very significant fivefold increase across the UK of anti-Semitic incidents, there was a lot of support voiced by very senior members of the SNP, including, I think, Humza Yousaf, certainly his wife, in support of the position of Gaza and not in support of the position in Israel. So that is a rather depressing, rather demoralizing, perhaps, thumbnail sketch of where I think Scottish politics sits with regard to Israel. There are, of course, those of us who dissent from that view, even though I'm no longer a member of the Scottish Parliament, it is still happily the case that there are a number of MSPs in Holyrood, particularly, but not only, on the Conservative benches, who are prepared not merely tacitly and silently to support Israel, but actively and publicly to do so as well. Now, many of these issues are likely, I think, in the coming months to come to a head. It's all a lot of this is a little bit under the radar at the moment. This is all part of the dangerous part of the iceberg, of course, is the bit that you cannot see. But I think we're going to be able to see quite a lot of it in short order because of the likely Scottish political reaction to the bill published by the United Kingdom government last month, and now given its second reading in the House of Commons, namely the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it is, as I'm sure we all know, the anti-BDS bill, which has been long in gestation, fulfilling a manifesto commitment that the Conservative Party made in its 2019 manifesto to ban public bodies from imposing their own direct or indirect boycotts, disinvestment, or sanctions campaigns against foreign countries, because, said the manifesto, these undermine community cohesion. They undermine community cohesion, but they also frustrate, I think, and are in conflict with British foreign policy. Natasha said in her introductory remarks that the United Kingdom, since the dawn of devolution some 25 years ago nearly now, has become a sort of quasi-federal state. It's certainly become a state in which there are multiple layers of government. But one of the features of all federal states, and certainly one of the features of the United Kingdom, even in this devolution era, is that foreign policy is reserved. And there is only one government in the United Kingdom that is responsible for making and setting foreign policy, and that is the United Kingdom government, accountable as it is to the United Kingdom Parliament in Westminster. Foreign policy, no element of foreign policy is devolved to the Scottish government. And that is, I think, the constitutional context in which I would like to say a few things, if I may, Natasha, about this bill. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds of how the bill is going to work, because I'm sure this organisation is going to be very active in thinking and talking about that, both to government and elsewhere. But I think I've already tried to explain what the purpose of the legislation is. The purpose of the legislation is to give effect to that manifesto commitment that I just quoted. It will be unlawful once this bill is enacted, assuming that it is enacted. It will be unlawful for a public authority to anywhere in the United Kingdom to make a procurement decision or an investment decision in respect of which they have allowed themselves to be influenced by political or moral disapproval of foreign state conduct. And that's a paraphrase of, it's a summation rather than a paraphrase of phraseology that's used in clauses 1 and 2 of the bill. The bill is UK-wide, so it will bind not only local authorities in England and Wales, but it would also bind local authorities and all other public authorities in Scotland, including the Scottish government. So it will be unlawful for the Scottish government to pursue, in short, it will be unlawful for the Scottish government to pursue any sort of BDS policy against Israel, unless, no, there's no unless. It will just be unlawful for the Scottish government. It will become unlawful for the Scottish government to do that. The purpose of this legislation is really to overturn the result of two recent English court cases. One which was decided by the English Court of Appeal in 2018 involving Leicester City Council, a case which was unsuccessfully brought by Jewish Rights Watch, where Leicester City Council had passed a resolution saying it was going to boycott goods from the occupied territories. Jewish Rights Watch argued that that was an unlawful resolution, and they were, unfortunately, in my view, unsuccessful in both the High Court and in the Court of Appeal in England, in that case in 2018. And then more recently in 2020, in a case brought by the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the UK Supreme Court ruled by a very narrow margin, by 3 votes to 2, that guidance that the Secretary of State had issued or had sought to issue under the Public Pensions Act was unlawful. So there are court cases about procurement decisions, and there are court cases about investment decisions that fail to rule that public authorities in the United Kingdom pursuing BDS strategies against Israel are acting unlawfully. Jewish Rights Watch tried to secure such a result in the Leicester case and failed. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign sought to overturn government policy that had tried to secure such a result and succeeded in the Supreme Court in the 2020 case. And the effect of the bill that we're talking about, the Economic Activity and of Public Bodies Bill, is effectively to reverse the results of those two cases. Now, what does this have to do with Scotland? Well, it has two things to do with Scotland. One, as I've already said, the bill will bind not only local authorities in Scotland, but also the Scottish government itself. So it will be unlawful for the Scottish government to seek to pursue any kind of BDS policy against Israel. And this triggers something which constitutional lawyers call the Sewell Convention. The Sewell Convention says that the United Kingdom Parliament will not normally legislate on devolved matters without first seeking the consent of the devolved administration, the relevant devolved administration, whether it's the Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish administration. So the conventional rule, this is a rule of the Constitution now, but it's not a legal rule of the Constitution, it's merely a conventional rule of the Constitution. It's a constitutional convention which says that the United Kingdom Parliament will not normally legislate on devolved matters without first seeking and indeed obtaining the consent of the relevant devolved administration. Now, you might think that the Sewell Convention doesn't apply to this bill because, as I've already said, this bill is a bill which is really about securing and undergirding and upholding the integrity and the singularity of British foreign policy. And foreign policy is reserved to Westminster, not devolved to Holyrood. But unfortunately, over the course of the last 25 years, the scope of the Sewell Convention has expanded so that it now is understood by both governments, both the UK government and the Scottish government, to apply not only where the UK Parliament is seeking to legislate on a devolved matter, which it's not doing here, because what it's seeking to do here is to legislate on foreign policy, which is reserved, not devolved, but that the Sewell Convention will also apply where the effect of UK legislation is to touch on the limits of the Scottish government's devolved competence. So it's really important, I think, that we understand that there is no power devolved by the UK Parliament to the Scottish Parliament, which is being affected by this legislation. Certainly there is no power which is being removed or taken away. We will hear nationalist squeals of power grabs as we did over Brexit, and they are as false with regard to this bill as they were with regard to Brexit. But what is true is that this bill makes it unlawful for the Scottish government to pursue a BDS policy against Israel. And indeed, also in clause 4, it will make it unlawful for the Scottish government to say that they would like to pursue a BDS policy against Israel and are constrained from doing so because of the force of this legislation. So for those reasons, the UK government has concluded that the consent of the Scottish Parliament will be required for this legislation to proceed. And that consent is not going to be given, is it? Rather obviously, for all the reasons that I've already outlined. And so the last thing I just want to say very briefly, if I may, Natasha, before taking or seeking to take everybody's questions, is what is the likely effect of all of this going to be? The likely effect of all of this is going to be that there's going to be a political row. As I have sought to stress in these remarks, the Sewell Convention is exactly that. It is a conventional rule of constitutional behaviour, not a binding rule of constitutional law. And it remains the law of the Constitution, even after devolution, that the United Kingdom Parliament may make or unmake any law whatever, and that nobody may override or set aside Parliament's properly enacted legislation. Dicey said that a long time ago in 1885, and it's still right, even now, even after all of this, it's still broadly correct. And so I think that this legislation will proceed to the statute book, assuming it's passed by the House of Lords as well as by the House of Commons. It will proceed to the statute book, notwithstanding the fact that it is, I think, unlikely to attract the consent of the devolved administration in Edinburgh. It might also be said that it's unlikely to attract the consent of the devolved administration in Wales, but I know less about Welsh politics, and I'm certainly no authority on it, but that is what I have read. But even if this legislation does fail to attract the consent of the devolved administrations, that won't stop the legislation from becoming the law of the land, and nor should it, because in my view, this legislation is 1, necessary, 2, long overdue, 3, correct in terms of seeking to reverse the results of the 2 cases that I've pointed to earlier. The fact that those cases were lost is all the evidence we need that this legislation is necessary. And I think it's absolutely right. And frankly, long since time for the United Kingdom to reassert itself with regard to ensuring that across all of the United Kingdom, there is simply one British foreign policy, which is set for the whole of the United Kingdom, Scotland included, by the United Kingdom government. So that's my political judgment about this legislation which I support, but legislation which I think will, as I said earlier in these remarks, crystallize some of the underlying tensions which exist between where Scottish politics is on the question of Israel and where United Kingdom politics is on the question of Israel. I hope that's enough to start things off with, and I hope I've been sufficiently controversial to inspire your hostile questions.
Well, Adam, thank you ever so much. Certainly the questions have been starting to flood in. I was going to ask you to start off, just look into your crystal ball and make those prophecies for the future, and you've already begun to do that, for which I'm very grateful. I should, in the first instance, reassure our audience that our next webinar on the 7th of August will in fact be on that very bill, dubbed the anti-BDS bill. There's been a great deal of controversy, as you say, also misinformation circulating around the bill and its legal implications. And so that will be grappled with on the 7th of August with our guest speaker, the one and only Jonathan Turner, CEO of UK Lawyers for Israel. But you're absolutely right that this is throwing up the constitutional issues that you've begun to sketch out because of the immediate opposition, the vocal opposition that we've heard. Can I then perhaps start with some of the questions that have come in on the bill specifically? In particular, if it's enacted in its current form, do you foresee any difficulty in it being enforced in Scotland? You've mentioned that it will go through to the statute books with or without consent. What's your thinking on enforcement if and when it comes to it?
I think that I don't think there'll be any problem enforcing the legislation in Scotland. I think the courts of all of the jurisdictions of the United Kingdom are broadly loyal to the United Kingdom constitutional order. They all understand the nature of Westminster legislation and the superior authority that it has over all other sources of law, including international law, in the United Kingdom. There have been occasions, as many of us will know, in the past where judges have sought to rattle some of those cages, but the rattling has stopped for the time being. And under the current leadership of the Supreme Court, I think the direction of travel is admirably clear and also correct. So I don't see a problem with that. What I think is more important, actually, than the legal enforceability of the legislation is whether the legislation will be understood sympathetically in public opinion in Scotland. And again, there, I think it will do. And I think it will do because it will be understood that this legislation is about securing, undergirding and protecting the integrity of British foreign policy. And even in nationalist circles in Scotland, it is understood that foreign policy is properly the prerogative of the United Kingdom. That's why they want to be independent of the United Kingdom, because they want to pursue their own foreign policy. They want to pursue their own defense policy. They want to pursue their own policies in areas which they can't pursue their own policies at the moment, because even though devolution is a very broad conferral of plenary legislative authority on the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is a very powerful sub-state legislature, more powerful than the American states, more powerful than the Australian states, more powerful than the German Länder in terms of the scope of its legislative authority. But it doesn't have any legislative authority with regard to foreign policy. And I think people understand that. Even people who are hostile to the idea that Scotland should remain part of the United Kingdom are hostile to that. So I think both in the courts of law and in the court of public opinion, this legislation will be successful.
staying with the bill, if I may, because that's prompted an awful lot of questions. To what extent do you feel that the Economic Activities of Public Bodies Overseas Matters bill has become, I'm so sorry, I was reading it directly off the questions and it's disappeared. Forgive me. Given procurement legislation in Scotland pays more attention to ethical procurement, how will that be affected if it becomes law? So if I can perhaps rephrase the question for a moment, on the premise that ethical procurement is more prominent in Scotland, and I'd be interested in your views for starters as to whether you think that's across the board or particularly an issue to do with Israel. Do you think that the anti-BDS bill is going to have more of an effect in Scotland than elsewhere?
I don't think so particularly, no. I mean, I think there are one or two local authorities that will be caught in it, that are likely to be caught in its crosshairs. One thinks of Dundee City Council, for example, but one can think of other examples equally south of the border. I already mentioned Leicester City Council, and there are others. There are others as well. I think ethical investment these days in Scotland, and I'm not a procurement expert, so I'm speaking inexpertly here, but I think ethical investment in Scotland these days is understood much more in ecological terms than it is in geopolitical terms. I think there is a significant public pressure and significant political pressure to disinvest from fossil fuels. That might not be quite so true in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, by the way, but it's certainly true in places like Glasgow, where I live. And I think so. The sense of ethical investment has got much more to do with climate justice and the climate crisis than it has to do with Israel.
More generally speaking, Adam, where there's an issue in Scotland concerning sort of general views with respect to Israel, do you have any particular recommendations on how best to address Scottish officials on the subject, especially given your experience in Parliament? Any tips for those that may be communicating or seeking to educate officials in Scotland?
Well, I think there is a relatively small but active, quite high profile, and very reasonable Jewish lobby in Scotland. There are well-established lobby groups in Scotland that represent, I think, very effectively the Jewish community here, which is largely concentrated in a single constituency. The constituency of Eastwood, which is just around the corner from where I live, south of Glasgow, and which is ably represented by my friend Jackson Carlaw, the Conservative MSP. So I think one's first port of call, if you were lobbying the Scottish government, or indeed any public authority in Scotland, and Jackson won't like me for saying this because he doesn't like it when his postbag mushrooms, but I think that if anybody has any difficulty lobbying or accessing Scottish government ministers or Scottish government officials or even local authorities with regard to matters pertaining to Israel or the welfare, rights and interests of the Jewish community in Scotland, then Jackson is a very good place to go. Jackson Carlaw is a very good place to go because he's very, very experienced at representing. He's been in the Scottish Parliament for 20 years and he's very experienced at representing the views and interests of the Jewish community. So it is true to say that, at the top end of Scottish government, there is a view taken about Israel, which is negative. But it is not true that that view is shared all the way down through Scottish civil society or indeed through Scottish politics. There are a number of MSPs, as I mentioned, not only in the Conservative Party, but probably most obviously in the Conservative Party, who are pro-Israel and are prepared to say so. There is, I don't think there is, I wouldn't want you to think that there is a kind of nationwide generic, systemic hostility to Israel, or indeed that there is widespread anti-Semitism in Scotland. I'm not Jewish, but my children are. They went to a Jewish primary school, and I don't think any of them have experienced any anti-Semitism in their young lives so far in Scotland. There is all sorts of prejudice at play in Scottish society, just as there is elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And I'm not trying to say for a moment that there is no anti-Semitism here, but it is not a where Scottish public opinion is on the question of Israel, I think, is in a different place and a happier and a healthier place than where the opinion of those who currently lead the Scottish government would be on that question.
I think that's an extremely important clarification, not least because we have joining us in the audience quite a number of individuals from Scotland who I'm sure from previous conversations will entirely support the analysis that you've just given. On the subject of those individuals in Parliament currently with positive views of Israel and positive feelings towards it, and taking into account your previously mentioning, of course, foreign policy being an accepted part of non-devolved powers. There was, of course, this spring, a policy paper, the 2030 roadmap for UK-Israel bilateral relations, which was quite historically signed between the various foreign ministries in Israel and the FCDO here, which sets out a very positive, strong roadmap for the building of an incredibly close relationship over the coming decade. Do you think that that assists those parliamentary members in Scotland? In your experience, is there any cooperation with the Foreign Office here or even groups perhaps associated with driving positive relations forward?
Yeah, so I think that the more we talk about this, the better, right? And specifically what I mean is that the more we talk about Israel, other than in the context of the security question and the question of the occupied territories, the more we talk about Israel as a normal Western principal key ally of the United Kingdom in trade terms as much as anything else, the better. And a number of people here will know that between 2012 and 2018, trade between Britain and Israel grew by 72%. And a number of people here will know that since then it's doubled again, right? So the value of UK-Israeli trade in 2017 was under 4 billion. The value of UK-Israeli trade in 2022 is more than £7 billion annually. And now this is good news for all sorts of reasons, not least because it shows that the BDS movement has catastrophically failed, right? I mean, the attempt to boycott goods from Israel, the attempt to disinvest, the attempt to impose sanctions on Israel has failed. It is a failing campaign. It's a very noisy campaign. It's a campaign that it makes a big nuisance of itself and so on and so forth. But it has failed. And those statistics, which I think are very welcome indeed, are all of the evidence you need to show that has failed. Now, firms, businesses, traders, individuals in Scotland are every bit as keen to trade with whoever they can trade with as firms, businesses, and individuals anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Scotland is an entrepreneurial nation as much as England is. I'm sure I don't have to reach for the cliche of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment to reinforce this point. I mean, the reason why we are in the Union, for goodness sake, the reason why we're in the Union with the rest of the United Kingdom is principally because of trade and our economic prosperity, which derives so much support from the Union. So look, there is a way in which Scottish businesses are unfairly favourably treated because they have not merely one, the UK government, but two, the UK and the Scottish governments, who can help them develop and foster relations with the rest of the trading world. Now, the sad reality is that at the moment, for geopolitical reasons, they're likely to get that help only from the UK government and not really from the Scottish government. But I don't know how those trade statistics break down in terms of what parts of the UK are principally benefiting from the exponential growth in trade that we see between Britain and Israel. But I would be staggered if none of that was coming to Scotland, or indeed if none of it was led in Scotland. Scotland is a trading nation. Don't let the Greens and don't let Hamza Yousaf's SNP delude you to the contrary. Scotland is a trading nation that wants to trade with the world.
Well, picking up then on Scottish trade, one of our questions asks, in order to assist trade, industry and tourism between Israel and Scotland, are there any plans to develop a direct flight between Scotland and Israel? Or do you think there's any reason why there may not be plans to do so? Is that something that you might have?
There were direct flights for a short time between, I think, Edinburgh Airport and Ben Gurion. I was never able to catch one. I don't think they survived COVID. And I think quite a lot of, regional aviation in this part of Europe has not survived COVID. And I'm not sure, I just don't know at this point whether there are realistic prospects for that kind of regular direct service to be reinstated, or whether we will continue to have to change when we fly to and from Israel in London or Frankfurt or Amsterdam or wherever. I don't think that the constraints on direct flights are really geopolitical. I think they're economic, and they're afflicting regional airports across the whole of Europe and have done since 2020. Strikes don't help either, do they? With 1,800 EasyJet planes having been cancelled from Gatwick yesterday, I think I read in the paper.
Yeah, the situation is not been a positive one. Adam, may I ask more generally, with your commentary already on political parties and the majority of the support coming from the Conservatives, one of our questioners asked, is there any realistic possibility of a political movement in support of Israel arising in one or more of the major parties in Scotland? And if so, do you have an idea of which party might lead it?
Well, the Conservatives are a major party in Scotland. The Conservatives have a quarter of the seats in Holyrood and a quarter of the vote. The Conservatives had a quarter of the vote in each of the last two Holyrood elections. The Conservatives are the second biggest party in Holyrood. It is a myth much propagated by Nicola Sturgeon and her friends that there are no Conservatives in Scotland, but it's not true. I think, however, it's probably also true that the Conservatives are unlikely to increase their vote share at the next Holyrood election. They might increase their vote share in Scotland at the next UK general election. That's a different question. But I think it's probably true that the Conservatives currently are unlikely to increase their vote share. But about a quarter of the Scottish electorate votes Conservative, and because we have a PR system in the Scottish Parliament, therefore about a quarter of the seats in the Scottish Parliament are occupied by Conservative MSPs. But the real shift that needs to happen in order to get rid of the SNP, and indeed also to get rid of the Greens out of power in Scotland, is a shift of SNP voters back to the Labour Party. And the reason why the SNP have done so well in Scotland for the last decade or so is because of a collapse in Scottish Labour's vote. So for every 4 former Labour voters who no longer vote for the Labour Party, 1 came to the Conservatives and 3 went to the SNP. So if you are the leader of the Labour Party, yes, you want to get those ex-Labour voters who vote Tory back. You want to get them back. But that's not going to get you over any kind of line, right? The people you really need back are the people who voted for the SNP, the people who used to vote for you, the Labour Party, who now vote for the SNP. And that's what Anna Sawar, who's the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, is strenuously seeking to do. And he's doing it by trying to talk about anything other than the Constitution. Because the only reason why these people left the Labour Party to start voting for the SNP is because they think they want independence. Sawar is saying, look, you might want independence, right? That's fine, but surely you also want decent schools for your kids, Surely you also want an NHS that is not on its knees. Surely you also want a government that is interested in working with rather than against the UK. Surely you also want a government, a Scottish government, that will invest in infrastructure and try and improve prosperity in Scotland. In other words, what he's trying to run on is the SNP's appalling domestic record in government, where the NHS really is in crisis, where Scottish schools are getting worse and worse. They used to be one of the prides and joys of Scotland, not anymore, where infrastructure investment is at an all-time low, and where prosperity is really struggling to get off its knees. And so the focus of Scottish politics, this is a seminar about Scotland and Israel, but Israel is very much a peripheral issue in Scottish politics. It's not front and center. It's nowhere near being front and center, and frankly, I wouldn't want it to be. Right, the issues that are front and center of Scottish politics are domestic. When they're not the constitution, they're domestic, and what Sawa, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, is trying to do, and he's having a degree of success at this, is he's trying to shift the focus of attention of voters away from the constitutional question towards this question of delivery. We have a Scottish government that has palpably failed to deliver either in terms of economic prosperity and growth, where the growth of the Scottish economy is even more sluggish than the growth of the UK economy. The productivity problem in Scotland is even greater than the productivity problem in the UK. And we also have unreformed public services. I mean, health and education are the core devolved services, and both have been reformed in England to greater effect, I think, in schools than with regard to the NHS, but neither have been reformed in Scotland. So the thing that the Scottish Parliament was created to do, take care of the NHS and look after Scottish schools, it hasn't done, because it's been obsessing with questions of the constitution and gesture politics, beloved by small-minded people like Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, Adam, I'm ever so conscious of the fact that we don't have the SNP or the Greens, in fact, on to defend themselves, but perhaps we can see if we'll get them on for a future webinar.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Issue some invitations, but I would like, if I may, to address a couple of questions on independence. And the first one is, to what extent do you feel that Scottish independence has become less likely in the foreseeable future as a result of the controversy surrounding investigations about the SNP finances, which might even involve Ms. Sturgeon? Do you have any sense of where that might be going?
Yeah, so look, I don't think there is any realistic prospect of independence happening in the foreseeable future. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court gave a judgment in November that made it more or less impossible, right? So the independence referendum in 2014 happened because both the governments, the UK government and the Scottish government, agreed that it should happen. And there was a formal binding agreement between the two of them called the Edinburgh Agreement, formally signed by David Cameron as Prime Minister and by Alex Salmond as First Minister of Scotland in Edinburgh in October 2012. And that agreement, that intergovernmental binding agreement, paved the way for the independence referendum in 2014. And that referendum was understood by both sides who signed that agreement to be once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime. Those aren't my words. Those were Alex Salmond's words. But of course, the losing side has wanted to rerun that referendum so ever since they lost the referendum in 2014. And their political desire to rerun that referendum has only accelerated in the period since Brexit. Nicola Sturgeon, when she was still First Minister, instructed her Lord Advocate to go to the Supreme Court to seek a ruling on whether the Scottish Parliament had the legal power to pass legislation that would trigger a second independence referendum, even if Westminster continues to refuse to consent to one. It wasn't the UK government that took that issue to court. It wasn't any unionist party that took that issue to the Supreme Court. It was Sturgeon who took that issue to the Supreme Court, and she unanimously lost. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously 5-0 in a breakthrough judgment in November that the Scottish Parliament has no legal competence to pass legislation that triggers even an independence referendum, never mind independence itself. And so the short answer, this isn't a very short answer, but trust me, there's a longer one. The short answer to your question is that there is no realistic prospect of independence without an independence referendum. And there is no realistic prospect of an independence referendum because the Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that we can't have one without Westminster's consent. And Westminster isn't going to consent because in Westminster's view, we've done it. We had an independence referendum. It was once in a lifetime, if not once in a generation, or perhaps the other way around, once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime. And the facts on the ground haven't changed. Poll after poll after poll continues to show that Scotland is divided on the independence question. Slightly more than half of Scots don't want independence, and slightly fewer than half of Scots do want independence. But also, poll after poll after poll shows in Scotland that nobody wants an independence referendum again anytime soon. So Scots say in all of the polling, and this is absolutely consistent across 9 years now of polling since the 2014 referendum, Scots say they don't want to be told that they can never have another independence referendum, but they also don't want to have another independence referendum, as it were, thrust down their throats by, over-enthusiastic nationalists now, because they know Scotland's not ready. They're not ready. They don't want to go through all of this again. And they don't think that even if they want Scotland to be independent eventually, they don't want Scotland to be independent yet, because our economy isn't fit for purpose, because there is no coherent answer to the currency question. And because the experience of Brexit has been that, creating an internal frontier within the United Kingdom is not good for trade, and is not good for economic prosperity. And so Brexit plays a complicated role in all of this, because it is true that Scots voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. And of course, we're not in the European Union anymore because the UK as a whole voted narrowly to leave. So there's a political imperative, there's a political pressure to have another independence referendum. But the economic reality of how you would now manage an independent Scottish state, given that the rest of the United Kingdom is outside of the EU, is a very different sort of independence from the sort of independence which was on offer and rejected by the Scottish people in the first independence referendum. So the economic reality has made independence much more difficult to make a success of, it seems to me. But the short answer to the question is that it's not the economy which is stopping a second independence referendum, it's the Supreme Court.
Well, one further follow-up question on independence before we move topic. And it's this: from your remarks, it would seem to be in the interests of Israel for the UK to remain united, yet the independence movement still enjoys quite strong support. What can be done in England and in Scotland to help maximise support for the union in Scotland?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and people have been asking me that question for a long time. And I wish I knew the answer. I think what has been happening over the course of the last few years, really, and since the UK left the EU, is that the UK government has been working very hard not to appear in Scotland as if it is just, not to appear in Scotland as if it's somebody else's government, and also not to appear as if the only thing that the UK government has got to say to Scots is, we don't like the SNP. So what the UK government has been trying very hard to do, and it's Michael Gove who more than any other single minister has led this, he is probably around the cabinet table the minister who has the greatest understanding of what the UK needs to do to cohere and thrive as a single country. It's Gove who's led this. And what he's really tried to do is to show, rather than tell, in Scotland, what it is that the value added is of Scotland being in the UK. So we talked earlier, Natasha, about trade. The extent to which the UK government can help and is helping Scottish businesses trade, not specifically with Israel, but with a variety of countries outside of the EU and indeed inside the EU. That is a project which has been massively accelerated since Brexit, and that's just one example. Levelling up is a cliche that we've all heard ad nauseum over the last few years. And like everybody else who uses it, I'm not quite sure what it means. But one of the things that is really important about the levelling up agenda is that it's understood to be UK-wide and not only about levelling up the north of England with the south of England. So there are lots of things at government level that are happening, I think, and have been happening, particularly since Brexit, that are very positive. And none of those things at the moment are really turning the dial, because, as I say, support for independence remains quite stubbornly in the sort of high 40s, and support for the union remains quite stubbornly in the mid 50s. But I think those things are preventing the dial from moving the other way. So, notwithstanding all of the pantomime and drama of British politics of late, notwithstanding Boris and Truss and COVID and its mismanagement and Brexit and its mismanagement, notwithstanding all of that, the nationalists have failed to capitalize on that situation, and they have failed to move the dial in their direction. And I think that is partly because of their failure in government, but it is also partly because the UK state is more nimble, more agile, more proactive, and more thoughtful about what to say and do in Scotland, and what to say and do for Scotland than it was before 2014.
One slight and what I hope may be a brief digression from the constitutional questions, because I think it's an interesting one. One of our audience members has asked if you know of differences between Scottish law and English law, which would have an impact on addressing anti-Semitic conduct or anti-Israel activity. So, for example, on discrimination or investment law or public order.
Yeah. No, that's a really important question, actually. The answer is complex. So equality law is reserved. So the Equality Act applies equally across the whole of Great Britain. I think it doesn't apply actually in Northern Ireland. I think Northern Ireland has its own equality legislation. But with regard to Scotland, Wales and England, we have the same equality law. But there was an act of Parliament, an act of the Scottish Parliament passed in 2021, which I had quite a lot to do with in my capacity as convener of the Justice Committee, which was a very controversial piece of legislation called the Hate, Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, passed in 2021. It's not yet been brought into force, but it's legislation which, if it is brought into force, will strengthen Scots criminal law offences with regard to hate crime, including, but obviously not only, anti-Semitism. One of the reasons why it hasn't been brought into force, in fact, I think the main reason why it hasn't been brought into force is because there's quite a lot of concern about the compatibility of that legislation with European free speech standards under Article 10 of the ECHR. And that concern was very vocal. That people were very vocal about that concern as the legislation was going through the Scottish Parliament in 2020, 2021, to the point where quite a lot of amendments to that legislation were made. Many of those amendments were in my name, that have complicated the legislation, because the line between speech which is protected and yet which nonetheless other people find offensive, and speech which is not protected because it is so abusive that it doesn't fall within the scope of free speech, that is not an easy line to navigate. It's not an easy line even to navigate in the comfort of of a law school seminar. It's certainly not an easy line to navigate if you're a frontline police officer with a trans activist in your station saying, I'm a victim of a hate crime because some gender critical feminist has denied me my rights, which is the reality of where we are with hate crime in the United Kingdom right now. So I don't really want to get into the trans issue tonight, but the if the short answer to that question is that if that legislation comes into force, then there will be stronger protections in Scots criminal law against hate crime than is currently the case in the criminal law of England and Wales. But that the legislation is not yet in force. And so for the time being, the legislative framework, the legal framework in both Scotland and England is broadly the same and is governed by the Equality Act.
Adam, in the last 5 minutes we've got together, I want to draw together a couple of questions to encourage you, perhaps in part, to gaze into that crystal ball, but also to provide our audience with some advice. One question asks, do you see any opportunities for improving relations between Israel and Scotland? Do they have interests in common? One question's put it somewhat more pointedly, and I'll read you that one together if I may. The questioner says, the Scots were valued as the British military's most feared warriors during the British Empire and subsequent 2 world wars. So do you think this is a national trait that uniquely links Scotland with Israel, which is smaller in size than Scotland, but has a similar warrior or survival ethos? Are there aspects of that you think that can be drawn upon in terms of those common interests? And perhaps one final question to throw into the mix comes from an individual who asks, what can we as ordinary citizens of Scotland do in the coming days?
Okay, so I'm going to leave you on I'm a positive person, right? I'm an optimistic person. I'm a conservative in Glasgow. That's a very different. Maybe that's a definition of something more extreme than optimism. Maybe that's a definition of lunacy. I don't know. But anyway, I'm an optimistic person, and I will going to leave you with this remark, with this thought. Such hostility as exists in Scottish politics to Israel is superficial, skin deep, and insubstantial. It's a hostility of convenience, not of principle. I think most of those who express ardently, strongly pro-Palestinian views in Scottish politics do so not because they really care about the Palestinian plight, but because they think it is a convenient way of distinguishing Scottish politics from British politics, which they think is more pro-Israel and less pro-Palestine than. So the differences are for that reason. So that's why, for example, if I can use a football analogy, that's why we see so many Palestinian flags being flown at Celtic. Not because Celtic football fans know anything at all about Palestine. In fact, Celtic have had 2 rather successful Israeli players of late, and yet still the fans fly the Palestine flag and not the Israel flag. It's not because they're trying to make any kind of statement about Middle Eastern politics. It's because they're trying to make a statement about Scottish politics, about how Scotland is oppressed, Scotland is occupied by an overweening English force and all of the rest of it. And look, I think that is all incredibly juvenile, and I don't actually think Scotland is a very juvenile place. I think Scotland's quite a mature, grown-up place with quite a mature and sophisticated electorate, a more sophisticated electorate, perhaps even than England's electorate. We have we have so many different electoral systems in Scotland now. We have STV for local government. We have additional member system for Scottish Parliament. We have first past the post, of course, for Westminster, and it doesn't seem to cause any confusion in the electorate. The electorate seems to know what it's doing in all of these elections. We have an informed and an articulate, more articulate than me, electorate in Scotland. And I think all of this will pass. All of this nonsense will pass. And I think that deep down, Scotland is a proud, small trading nation that will do business with other proud, small trading nations. And Israel is, of course, one of those.
Well, on that extremely positive and optimistic note, I'm ever so grateful for the time that you've taken to give us your insight. You hold a unique position, I might suggest, in terms of your academic background and expertise, but also your practical experience. having served in the Scottish Parliament and also advised here in Westminster. So, Adam, Professor Tomkins, thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
Wishing you well in your endeavours north of the English border, and looking forward to being in touch in the future.